Go ahead and start right now, and we may have some more people sign in a bit later, maybe after the introductions, but that will be great. I'm Karen Denby, co-chair of the Intereach webinar series, and this month we're again fortunate to have a compelling topic and some excellent speakers. I want to ask that everyone sticks around until the end as my fellow co-chair, Dr. Christine Glauber, provides some information about the October webinar, which will be a little bit different in format. Rounding out our planning team for Intereach activities are Drs. Matt Hotze, Hipsbeezy, and Christine Hendren. And at this point, I'd like to go ahead and invite Christine Hendren to introduce our speakers.
Thanks so much, Karen. This week, we're really excited to have three presenters, a team that is going to tell us about a Co Navigator tool. It's worth mentioning briefly that the way we found out about this is by following the I2S Insights blog that Gabrielle Bammer keeps up. It's a really great resource for finding just a watering hole of people who are working in this space and have great ideas. And the Co Navigator tool seems very specifically relevant to the Intereach crowd, who are people, as we know, that are trying to span boundaries as one of their primary roles. And so this team is creating a method that we can hopefully follow. And I want to also say that we should be listening out for things that they need from us as a community in terms of feedback and opening up a community of people that can help give each other give and take and ideas and communities of users for tools that are put out like this. So individually, I want to give just a little brief introduction to each of these researchers. So they're coming to us from Denmark today. Katrine Lindvig is an educational ethnographer at the Department of Science Education at the University of Copenhagen. And she specializes in interdisciplinary education, particularly the linkages between interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary teaching practices. That is personally very fascinating to me, all of that. But so then next to her, and they are actually sitting in this order on the screen, so this is perfect, is Lina Hillersdal, and she's a social anthropologist and assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology, also at the University of Copenhagen. And she specializes in interdisciplinary research collaboration, particularly involved in how research objects are configured in collaborative practices. And finally, David Earle is a concept developer and partner at Brain Trust, an academic think tank, which is also based in Copenhagen, Denmark. And he develops visual and tactile tools and methods to help students learn to navigate through their academic knowledge and to work more effectively in multi and interdisciplinary teams. I think we could definitely spend an entire hour just unpacking each of those awesome job descriptions. But this particular hour, we will spend hearing from these three researchers on the Co Navigator tool. So with that, I will mute and welcome you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to swap over here and see if we can start to share our slides. Hopefully we'll be able to see those. Does that look as it should to people? I hope. Yes. Good.
Yes.
Good. So the title of our talk today is part of the process towards an integrated interdisciplinary problem-solving tool. So what we would like to take you through is a brief introduction about ourselves. You've already heard a lot of words put out. Also the background to Co Navigator, where it came from, and how the tool works today, and then later on taking it towards people listening, how we can use it as an integrated problem-solving tool in the future. So hope we can get a lot of feedback from what we share with you today.
Yeah, so just some words of presentation. I don't think I need to say much, but we come from different angles or perspective into this work of interdisciplinary collaboration. I come from experience with biomedical researchers and lifestyle disease and living with chronic disease. So having to deal with the practical sort of everyday engagement with researchers from other disciplines and how to solve problems is sort of my my point of departure into this endeavor with my two partners here.
Yeah, and my name is Katrine, and I come from a different place, you could say, than Line. We've actually met exploring interdisciplinary collaboration and education in some of the same research projects. But my background is within educational studies, and so the point of departure for me in this collaboration has been looking at interdisciplinary education, and especially the activities and courses.
And I'm David. I come from the creative industries. I've had 25 years background in various different creative roles. So my input point to this has been developing interdisciplinary workshops and collaboration workshops with students, based on a very simple idea that if you're able to state a problem, then the problem can be solved. And we would always took it further. If you're able to build a problem, then you might be able to understand it better. And if you're able to see a problem, then you can more easily see the solutions. And if you can build that problem together, you can see its interdisciplinary nature. And hopefully that might lead to more interdisciplinary solutions. So we had these very intense one-day co-creation labs where we could help students find better ways of working together and solving complex problems. And they were literally able to walk around a problem that they built and contextualize each person's discipline within the problem. So they could see their own problem inside a model, and they could also see other people's, other disciplines' part of the problem, and then be able to find connections and new ways of solving the problems. And it's very hands-on, very, very energetic, very creative. People were able to come outside of the more abstract thinking and use their hands and their bodies to develop something complex together. And they could walk around it as a three-dimensional thing. The problem became this object in which they might be able to see solutions within the problem. So these were these intense one-day sessions. They weren't intended to be to last any longer than that. They had their own situated instance, and then I was asked by Katrine, who had been working with me on some of these labs, if I would join up with Lina here for a workshop on solving the problem of obesity. And this is where the genesis of a more codified version of these workshops came from. So we developed a tool called Co Navigator, which is a hands-on interdisciplinary collaboration problem-solving tool. And we'd like to take you through some of the steps now of how that tool works.
Yeah. So basically, what was needed and what became apparent through the research that Lina and I did was that we could see these attempts of creating interdisciplinary educational activities and interdisciplinary collaboration, but there were all these obstacles. I mean, there were differences in hierarchy of being the university. There were differences in terms of how much the scientists from the biomedical part would contribute compared to the humanities and social sciences and so on. These are not new things. But basically what we saw a need for was a tool that could create this basis for democratic collaboration, whether that was in research or in educational settings. Do you want to add something to that? No? So basically what we'll talk you through here is the different steps that our tool consists of. And a very first part in this tool is what we call an interview session. So basically, in order to create this democratic platform or base in the collaboration, we saw a need to be very explicit about what is created around the table, what do the people participating in the collaboration, what do they bring with them in terms of skills and competencies? Because what we saw was that very often the scientists would easily and very readily talk about what they brought to the table, whereas it would sometimes be more difficult to identify for the students and the researchers from the humanities and social sciences what concrete competencies they would bring. So this first part of the tool is about identifying, for instance, competencies, talking about that, and then creating what we call tool swatches. The idea behind these tool swatches is that you, in a very tangible and physical way, show the things you bring to the table, and you interview each other so that in order to get more of those competencies out. So the idea that when you're interviewed about what you can do, these things are put into Word, and then you can write them down and have them physically in these tool swatches.
Yeah, and then the next step of the tool is what we have termed identifying the field. And normally we wouldn't start with a problem. We would start with a theme. And then each of the participants around the table will have maybe a set of 10 tiles to write on. And they should start associating or just imagining things individually that would sort of characterize the theme of the workshop, and produce maybe 10, 12 tiles with different words, associations, whatever they would like to contribute to that particular field. And they will do that for 2 to 3 minutes, just writing. And one of the reasons why we wanted that to be particular is that it's different from what we normally think of as a brainstorm, which is done collectively. So the importance of having everyone contribute 10 tiles is also, I mean, it has the possibility of everyone sort of also materializing the same volume within a map. So it can be also democratic in that sense. So after they have written these tiles individually, we go to the step we call create a shared topography. So normally we will have all the participants stand up around a table, and they will try to arrange the tiles according to a map that they somehow negotiate real time, can you say. So they're around the table, so they start to say, does this really map onto what you have over here, and what is actually the bits and pieces of the theme that we share somehow.
And there's a lot of negotiation that happens here.
Yeah.
People have to agree in a very egalitarian and democratic way how the topography should be and how it should look, how things connect with each other.
All right. So now imagine that you have all these tiles and the topography on the table, and the importance again being that none of these tiles have been removed. They all have a place on the table. The idea with this step is now to flag the topography, to sort of mark where you find your interests on the map. You could sort of see it as a heat map. And again, it's a very situated step, because what these stickers reflect is not the final set. It's one step where you show this is very interesting, and you can put as many stickers on these on as many tiles as you would like. And as you can see, there's a room for your sticker on each tile.
So each of the tiles is in itself identical. They're all white tiles, and they get an added value when each person within the group adds their stickers to it. So there's no hierarchy within the tiles themselves. There becomes a hierarchy when there's a democratic choice to focus on certain tiles.
Yeah, so the next step is what we call the zoom in and out. So having flagged all the tiles, some of them will have 4 stickers and some will have none or fewer than 4. But this step where you zoom in, you will then negotiate and choose some of the tiles that had 4 stickers on. And we see this as an interest, which is too general. So we try, the next step will be to zoom in by each participant to write down their particular understanding or version of that term, which they all share. So it's a way of producing more context to a particular term or a phenomenon on that tile, and also being aware that maybe we have a shared language, but what we share is often not known in these particular collaboration. And also there will be a tendency to cluster around buzzwords like socioeconomic status, or things that it's out there, but it's not really clear to all the participants what is actually implied with these sort of super concepts sometimes that everyone can say yes to or agree is important to work on. And also the opposite step of zooming in would be the zooming out, where we sort of motivate the participants to explore areas of the map where there's no interest or little interest, to see and also produce tiles to that, or context to that particular tile, to state how could that area of the map become interesting to the other participants. Because sometimes if there are no marks on that tile, it can also be a lack of curiosity, or a lack of what can you say, you don't sense you have any power to do anything about what stands on that tile. Maybe it's a political structural thing, and you think, well, I don't have any influence on that particular thing anyways. But sometimes by producing context to that tile, something comes up that you can actually do something about.
Could I just add something?
Yeah, please.
To that? Good. Yeah, so just to add a final thing with this zooming in and out, it's also, again, going back to this democratization, that if you, for instance, are working in a group of 4, where one is a professor and one is a student, you would perhaps see a tendency of the student putting her or his stickers on the same tiles as the professor in order to respect the hierarchy. But in order to have this step where you zoom out and you actually have to pay attention to the more cold areas in this heat map, is a way to make sure that all the voices are heard and that you're not just navigating by the one with the higher ranks. All right, so after this zooming in and out, and imagine this is also a way to create depth to the topographies that you've created, so that you make sure that you're not just left with the, as Line said, the buzzwords or the agreements around quite superficial terms. But this is actually a step where you then go back to the individuals and ask them to elevate what they see as key areas. And a key area can be a tile that it has 4 stickers on, but it can actually also be an area that has no stickers on. This is a step where the 4 individuals around the table get to choose what they consider to be a key area in this topography. And then the next part is where the attempt is to build roots between these key areas. So imagine 4 very different tiles that have been elevated, and 4 very different topics or aspects of a theme. The idea is now to discuss and negotiate what could be bridges that would tie these different areas together. So again, a lot of negotiation goes into this area, but again, the attempt is to make it democratic in the sense that they are all equally elevated, and they have all been chosen by the 4 individuals on around the table.
These are earlier prototypes that you're seeing of the tool, but nevertheless, what we will want to do is to continue encouraging this type of tactile collaboration. There needs to be a sense of collaboration and achievement when you make a link from one elevator block to the other. And then from there, we come right back to the beginning by using the tool swatches. And if you remember earlier, we had the competencies, the skills, the things that each of the individuals can bring to the table. Now it is their opportunity to see how they could use these to build these bridges and to actually make some of the connections that take place in reality. Again, this is a negotiated phase, and it's something that each of them can present their specific part of the solution and part of the problem into the bigger picture. There are variations upon how to use the toolkits. Originally, what was very important in this was for some undergraduates who might not feel like they had something to give to a specific problem at their point, but this was actually to raise their awareness of what they had at that particular time to bring to the table. The tool swatches themselves you could bring home with you, or you could bring to the next day of the school or the seminar to remind yourself of what it is you can bring. But for more diverse groups, we can think about these tools as being parts of the solutions and building blocks of the solutions and the bridging of the solutions. Good. So that's where we are today. That is roughly how the Co Navigator tool works today. But what we really want to bring it is into a tool which is used as part of the ongoing problem-solving process. So rather than it being an isolated event where groups sit and come to that building routes and using the tool swatches, there needs to be an ongoing process where they can come back and re-navigate and re-co-navigate a specific problem when they get further down the problem-solving path. So what we'd like to show you is this is where we are in a normal initial session where you have the interviews, building the topographies, zooming in and zooming out, building routes and swatches. There is a question of what comes after this, what's next? The most obvious question that people will have is, will there be a digitization of this? Will there be some kind of digital augmentation of this? And the answer is, well, yes, we hope so. And we are in negotiation and discussion with the Image Research Institute in UMBC in Baltimore, where we're looking at how to develop a digital element to the tactile tool. But before we get on to that, we'd like to go through how we see the general structure of an ongoing process being.
Yeah, so basically what you can see in this flowchart is the Co Navigator session that begins this, and that could look like what we've just walked you through. But then adding this part with the digital content, where basically what has come out of this Co Navigator session will be digitized in some format. So imagine that the topography is something you're able to access online, and perhaps you're even able to look deeper into the different tiles or to move around the tiles, all these different types of working forward with what came out of the initial topography. And in that sense, some cross-pollination could also take place, because while each tool is used by 4 people, you will probably usually have more groups in the same room. So for instance, 4 groups of students working. So imagine that they've been going through a Co Navigator session. The topographies and the content and the outcomes of their individual sessions has then been digitized, and then they go out and work in groups, perhaps problem-oriented group work or smaller research groups or work packages. But then you will see that the digital part will enable a cross-pollination also after this individual group works. And then one idea could be to then move on to what we call a seeded co-navigation. So basically creating a session that builds on what has been already created, and then building upon that. Yeah, so we just, in these following, we just wanted to show you some different ways of thinking about the Co Navigator tool. So what we have here is how it could be used as part of an interdisciplinary program. It could be climate change studies, it could be public health studies, for instance. And what we would like to emphasize here is that the Co Navigator tool could be used in the planning phase as well. So enable, again, a democratic base where heads of study, the faculty teaching, perhaps even student representatives, to be able to plan and make visible all these tacit assumptions about the program and about what you will be focusing on in the courses, and then use it as a planning tool in that sense. Moving on, using the tool as an initiation part for the program, but then also using it in the different modules of the program, and then the digital content will link these different sessions, for instance.
Yeah, and this next slide is an example of how I've been using it as a research tool to develop an intervention with health professionals from various disciplines. But this is an example of a more, you can say, facilitated version. So I would do several co-navigating workshops, but then I will sort of, instead of having maybe the digital framing of the categories and bringing that to the next workshop, here I would just take all the themes from the workshop and analyzing them and coding them and bringing them to the second workshop. And then for the third, to have this sort of iterative co-creational phase, developing an intervention for a particular target group. But I mean, you can do that in different ways, and I'm sure the digital version would also, I mean, it could be possible to implement that here also, I think, in that particular setup.
So finally, we have a rough diagram of how we see a subsequent co-navigation session could work in the future, where we have the original co-navigation, the results of that, and maybe the added information that might have been negotiated in between the first co-navigation and the subsequent one, and that will provide the information to produce, for example, augmented tool swatches, which would mean that if one group has maybe learned something new on the basis of what has happened before, they can add those to the tool swatches. Not only that, there could be some barriers that need to be addressed, which would go on to the tool swatches at this point. And they will be added to what we call the seeded field, as you saw before from Katrina, which is rather than starting from scratch where people map from the beginning, they map from the endpoint of the previous combined co-navigations from the different groups. And from there, we can zoom in and zoom out and create a new map from those seeded fields and create this next step towards the solution. And the following sections would match pretty much how the co-navigation sessions would work in a normal session, until finally we go back and we digitize that co-navigation again and then on to the next one. So that gives you some type of roadmap to where we see Co-Navigator being used as an ongoing problem-solving tool. So that was what we have to talk about for now. We'd be delighted to have any input from this point. I'm going to stop sharing, and you'll see our faces hopefully again. Yes.
Wow.
Good.
Well, thank you all so much for that presentation. It was, I like the ability to weave in the physicality of it, you know, using, as you stressed even in your presentation of it, just connecting other parts of your brain, your body, your hands, you know, making it a physical instantiation of what's happening. And so I have a trillion questions, but I don't want to start with me. I think I will open it up and see if anybody else has a question that they want to either type in if you want to, or just pipe up.
Hey, I've got a question. Okay, so yeah, I really love the simplicity of the materials, and I love your graphics. They're really great. My questions are a little bit yeah, well, I'll just ask them. My first one is like, when you are working in the identify the field stage, is it important for individuals to work in groups versus as individuals? Is that important, or does it not really matter?
It does matter. I think for all three of us, from different points of view, it matters very much. I mean, certainly, just from my perspective, from the creative industries, the brainstorming as it stands is something that we would try and avoid where possible, because you end up with a form of groupthink, and in the group dynamics, you tend to have one person dominating the way that a specific narrative is going to go. So to democratize this, we like people to be able to write their own points of view and their own disciplines requirements for a shared topography.
Yeah. So if I could just add to that, I think it's also because if you do a joint brainstorm to begin with, as David said, you tend to have one leading it. But also sometimes what happens is that you start creating a more generalized version of a brainstorming. So thinking, okay, what would be things you could say in this brainstorm? So storm the brain instead of actually curating what you want to have on that map. And I think what we usually say when facilitating this, especially when it's participants with diverse backgrounds, is that they should think about this as a map that would hang in their department or in their office. What would be crucial to have on that map? So in order to really let them focus on what they bring, and thus making the topography much more situated than if you just, with the example of obesity, for instance, if you just thought about in general terms, what would be on a map of obesity, that's much less interesting than what would be on your joint topography.
And in fact, the aha moments tend to happen in the zooming in part of the process, because it is when there is an understanding that there has been a misunderstanding, as it were, in terms of how people interpret a specific term or specific concept. And when you zoom into that and reveal the divisions, or reveal the two different points of view from the disciplines, that's where the aha moments can really occur.
Could I follow up on something about that? Because that's one of my favorite things to try and systematize how you can bring out. I like how you said that the understanding that there has been a misunderstanding, that really shines a light on where the conversation is and how to, tease out the misaligned assumptions. Could you go over again? I know you talked about this. What do you do in that aha moment? Because I see the mapping of what you bring to the table and how you could all utilize that and going toward a joint deliverable. Do you do something specifically to note on that map this teased out assumption, this misunderstanding that's then brought into light from the shadows?
Well, it's hands-on collaboration, but hands-off facilitation. And this is something that I've learned a lot from both Katrina and Lena. I think you probably would.
Yeah, so not controlling. I mean, it's not that there's a particular aim, so that you have to sort of stop everyone and write down. But sometimes, I mean, we would record the sessions also for the groups to look into and code themselves. So, it depends on how you arrange the facilitation, I think, because, of course, as a facilitator, you can also play a role as sort of helping them do the field work or the analytical process. At least I've been doing that. But I think most of the sessions we've had, it's their collaboration. So, they're the one having their aha moment. And often we would not be present to, police that moment in any sense. So,
but one example could be when we had a group of students where some areas were just left completely deserted, no stickers, no nothing. And we were kind of curious I mean, they then had to zoom in and zoom out and try and figure out what did these deserted tiles have in common, what could make it interesting. So in this zooming out phase, trying to find common ground there, and they realized that the reason why they hadn't flagged and put their stickers on these tiles were because they all had a sense that that was out of their control. They didn't have, they couldn't influence these tiles, and so they left them blank. And that actually created an aha moment for them, that they realized, okay, so we flag the stuff and the themes that we feel we can influence. So what could make us able to influence these deserted tiles? So I think that was one example of an aha moment where they actually shared the same feeling. They just didn't know that they shared that feeling, and then they could reach common ground from that.
That really shows the power of the zoom in, zoom out, and the flexibility of it. So I see what you're saying, that you can't necessarily prescribe, okay, now list out all the assumptions you thought you had and the things you didn't know, and that might be too kind of limiting versus this zoom in, zoom out. I see what you're saying. It bubbles up whatever needs to happen in that conversation from that experience.
Yeah, I think though that there is a need in the long run to be able to, should we say, record these moments in some better way, and this is something we need to look at. Particularly if we're imagining we would have multiple groups with a shared aim of solving a specific problem, the nuggets of goals that rise to the surface during the process need to be somehow revealed in the output, particularly in the digitization. And this is something we've been having a lot of talks about how best to do this. But it's certainly not, it isn't a problem we have solved yet.
This is Pips, and just wanted to thank you for the presentation. That was fantastic, and I echo all of the positive accolades so far said. I love the images, and it reminds me a little bit of group concept mapping that I've used for my dissertation. And just see so many similarities, but I love the tactile piece of it and being able to kind of move things around. So I have lots and lots of questions, but I guess maybe the top two, when you're identifying the field, I'll just ask two. When you're identifying the field, how do you prep people for that? Like, what are the instructions that you're giving people, and how do you lay that out for them? And then my other question is, when you're doing flag the topography, how do you avoid, the fact that a couple of people are going to put stickers on something and everybody's watching and like, oh, that's, your view, like, I've done this, even though I know I'm doing it, that I see somebody put a sticker on and I kind of want to know what that was. And my interest is kind of drawn there as somebody else puts a sticker on. So I just maybe can ask those two questions and stop and see what your responses are. But this is fantastic. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, so in terms of identifying the field, we talked a little bit about it before. It can be quite daunting to begin with. You have this group of people all sitting, this theme, what could it be? And so basically, once again, it's allow for this confusion, to not give them directions. We found that it helped asking them to think of this map, think of it as the name of a map. So for instance, we've had people co-navigating a theme such as student participation or student engagement. And then we basically write it up and ask them to identify this field. So it's about asking them to write ideas, concept, even draw. I mean, make it quite open to them that it's what they identify to be important for this field. And again, also stress that this is what they think should be on that map. So it's not anything goes. It's not what comes to mind. It's what do you think is important to put on that map. And I don't, in terms of the other part, that's definitely very often the case, as you say, that one starts adding like very aggressively stickers onto all the tiles, and then the people feel, the other people around the table feel compelled to do the same thing. One thing that helps that to remain a democratic act is the zoom in and zoom out afterwards. It's also stressing that they're actually allowed to flag all of the tiles if they wanted to. And it's also the design of the tiles. So maybe I can just, I don't know, where is it here? Can you see it? So yes. Basically, yeah. So there's an individual space for each participant, whereas if it was just blank so that people could just add it without a certain space assigned for it, then perhaps it would seem a bit more crowded. But here they have a designated space on each tile. So these are some of the steps that help them navigate on their own. But of course we can never, and I think Lina also said that, we can never control completely what happens in this group dynamics. But the tool is certainly designed in order to at least make a democratic base, so to say.
I think something we would like to explore is if we work with over a longer term with a larger group of people on a complex problem, that we might split the groups down into specific parts of the problem, which they would identify a certain area of the fields. And those things would then get put together at the end of a co-navigation and then re-put together, so that you would have a cross-pollinated, more complex picture of a problem as you go on. But I think there's a lot of ways we can explore exactly what the field is, depending on who it is you're with and what you're actually trying to do with it.
Yeah, I totally see what you say about that last point. Having worked with several kind of really big interdisciplinary teams in Alaska that are trying to kind of wrap their minds around, what the idea of One Health might be. So when you're, animals and people and ecosystems, and the health of each is dependent upon the other, but they're, trying to be inclusive of our campus to allow people to intersect in that idea wherever they might, just leads infinite possibilities. So I could see starting with like a campus Co Navigator kind of exercise, but then and really using that maybe to kind of inform what working groups might look like, splitting them off and then bringing everybody back together at the end, over the course, I don't know how, over the course of time. But I see so many uses for this in so much of the work that I do. And I feel like I keep trying to figure out how to do what you guys have done, and it's just brilliant. And I would love to be able to use it sometime.
Great, we'd love to work with you.
That is a kind of a good segue to a question I have. How do you envision user groups taking you up on this? Do they kind of hire you all as consultants? Is there a little tool that you can train other people in to utilize? Because I guess to back up just a little bit, I had a meeting yesterday with somebody who runs a cancer center and chairs many transdisciplinary groups that are each tasked with solving very particular questions. And we spoke about the difficulty of, very high level busy people who understand their transdisciplinary charge in some way and have a bit of skepticism potentially against what they might perceive as, what I call like a trust fall or, personality testing or these types of more genericized, hey, let's look at ourselves as a group, rather than a very targeted tool like this. What I like about what you guys have done is that you're asking several things you've said, particularly Katrina, you're asking people to don't just think about this as a nice process, but what is your very, very targeted personal map going to do for you in achieving the goals you have, so you even kind of keep this around. So I'm picturing, not only, as Pip said, how can maybe I utilize the the great tool that you've made, how could we pull you into things and the Co Navigator into things? And then also, how can we maybe use this to leapfrog over some of the skepticism? Even though this is a very it seems like a game, right? And okay, you're going to do these colored dots and you're going to do these things. But, you know, how do we leave people with a tangible thing? And do you find that you're able to convince people past the skepticism? So I did the thing I always do where I accidentally asked two totally separate questions in a one question. How can we use what you do? And do you find that this leapfrogs skepticism?
I think the skepticism, is really valid comment, because I work with a lot of regional hospitals, and it's all the time that problem that they're actually very curious, but they can't really put enough time into that. So, but I think it's, the development somehow is with us in the sense that they have more and more interdisciplinary teams working who see the possibility of actually strengthening these kinds of collaborations. Not that it's, you know, answering your question, but I really see the skepticism there, but I also see light ahead.
Yeah, and there's something about, I mean, again, going back to that same old with the hierarchies. I know Lina's you've had issues like with doctors and nurses at different levels in that hierarchy, which can be quite strong. And certainly we also see it within academia, you have the professors with not a lot of time and students and so on. What we found is that the design actually has a lot to do with it, because you could certainly say that one way of reaching more people would be if people just did sort of the same steps with Post-its, or, you know, building it yourself. But it's quite crazy how much more legitimacy you find in these tiles, and especially because in these wide brainstorming sessions you do at a workshop, or where you try and gather your colleagues, where do all the Post-its go when they die? I mean, the sticky notes, they're everywhere, and it's difficult sometimes to collect them, whereas these tiles are not really going anywhere. And certainly they're all staying on the table, and they have equal space, no small or big sticky notes. And our idea of developing the digital version is also to continue to working with whatever has been created, because that's really, I mean, that's the next major step. How do we take all this, all these results, all the discussions, and sort of keep them and work on them?
Yeah, in terms of the design, we've been extremely miserly with what we put into it. As you probably noticed, everything is as white as we can make it. The only color is just to identify the four individuals that are on the table without having a hierarchy on them. And we at the beginning did call it a gamified tool, but we don't use gamified in case people think of it as a game, even though there are rules as though it were a type of game involved. These are process steps which we are honing in, and we haven't got the design absolutely right. So in terms of how you could use the tool in the future, we are developing, using 3D printing at the moment, constant new sets and prototypes which can be purchased. It helps us build the next prototypes as we go. But in terms of starting off with using the tool, as you've probably gotten, the steps are tricky, and when we implemented it in UMBC, we spent a week with them going through different sessions and explaining the different processes. So, I mean, ideally, if you did want to work with us, we would spend a few days with you and go through the facilitation process with you.
That's great. That's really great. And I guess just a quick follow-up to make sure that you all have this as a platform. What is, for us now, or for people who are watching this back on our webinar that's launched, what is the most useful thing that you could learn from people who are watching this?
I would really love to hear how, if people have been involved in ongoing sessions with groups of people who are almost the same groups, might be slightly changing over time. How does a problem or a field or a subject develop for them over time, and how could they see this being woven into the solving of those problems? And what do you think we need to be most mindful of to get there?
Yeah, I almost imagine this being like you go into an architecture firm and they have those little tiny models under glass of whatever it is that they've built. I could imagine if you had a shared working space, what if you had your built Co Navigator, towers and lines and everything, and it just stayed. These are probably not the terms that you would use, but and it just stayed there physically, and you could visit it. I think that would be so cool.
Yeah, and I mean, so one of our small dreams has been that we would be able to create a tool where people would be able to have it in their office space. And then whenever they realize, okay, we're talking about this issue, but we're not really talking about the same thing. So when you say discourse, you say this about that term, but I'm thinking something differently. Let's co-navigate this term and let's see where that takes us. So basically you could see it as this tool to help long-term processes, but also in the everyday, because what we see basically in this, and certainly within interdisciplinary teams and in problem solving, is that you tend to start with the problem, and then you go a big way into solving it, and you realize that you're actually solving 4 different problems, and then it's too late. So actually going a step back, taking a step back, and then looking at, wait a minute, when we use these terms and themes, what do we actually mean? So in order to get the path clear.
And also, I mean, allowing that process to be slow, and also materializing. Because I think often when you sit in these collaborative units, you talk, but you're not really aware of the conceptual developments along with that talk. And I think what the tile is doing is actually sort of slow motion, through these conceptual maps somehow.
Yeah, I mean, something that I'm very mindful of is to try to keep people staying within the problem without jumping to the solution too fast. So you could also call this a problem building tool as well as a problem solving tool. So to keep people in that zone, because the better they can describe the problem, the better the outcomes should be.
I totally agree with everything you just said, and I feel like I've said those exact words so many times myself in the last couple of years, where I've watched our team, which is very interdisciplinary, and anywhere from kind of 10 to 100 people, thinking about how Alaska is changing from lots of different perspectives. And 10 years ago, I watched our group come together, and we put a proposal together, we got funded, we had 5 years of funding, and then the National Science Foundation said, hey, why don't you put together a conceptual map of what you're doing? And so we struggled with that, and but it was super useful, and we had like 3 different scales, like this macro and this meso and this micro scale of kind of these conceptual maps, and I was like, wow, this is really helpful. But it was mind-boggling, because we would have these conversations about what we were doing and what the conceptual map was, and I felt like 2 weeks later we were having the same conversation. So I was like, I don't feel like we're progressing. And then we've been using this this visualization space that we have at the university, which is like, I don't know if you've seen the Arizona State University Decision Theater, but it's this space that you can kind of sit in, and you're surrounded by the big screens, seven big screens, and we've been co-developing our conceptual maps now with the whole group being involved with that, and everybody can see it, everybody participates, and those conversations are like actually progressing now. So we come back 2 weeks later and everybody has the same idea, you know, it's that shared mental model of what we've just done, and it sticks, and 2 weeks later we progress on from there. And it's been really exciting to kind of see that evolution in the last like decade. And I keep trying to think of different ways of, you know, facilitating that conversation. And frequently I'm like, okay, well then you draw it. You know, if this isn't where it goes, then please come up and take the marker, or we have lots of digital stuff. But I so relate to everything that you just said about the conceptual maps and the development of ideas, and it's just really exciting to have you guys here.
Great, thank you very much. I'd love to see more of that, what you're doing with it in Arizona. That sounds absolutely amazing. Yeah.
That sounds perfect for a next webinar. All right, well, we will make sure and put your links to your website in the link on our website to people who can watch this, and encourage anybody who is watching to give the feedback that you all asked for, or reach out, because it sounds like this is just the beginning of a lot of very cool tool development. Thank you guys so much for joining us and sharing this with us.
And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I just want to pop in and give everyone a heads up about our next webinar. It's going to be on October 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And this one is going to be about sharing research resources and approaches among the Intereach community. So my co-chair and I, Karen Demby, are going to be we want to hear from you, from the entire community. So we want to basically build our community, foster deeper connections amongst the community, and we really want to open up the discussion to learn from you and from each other. So we want to ask questions. What topics do you guys want to see presented for the spring lineup of 2019? Who would you like to hear from? And in that same vein, please go ahead and take a look at our past webinars. If you go to intereach.org/webinars, you can look at all of the old ones, including this one will be up there pretty soon. And so you can let us know what you need from your community of practice. And then we also want to talk about what resources and tools from various toolkits do you find most helpful. So let's share what has helped help us overcome challenges as we move through the space. So we look forward to lots of participation in that one. So thanks, guys. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to maybe you guys joining us for that one.
Look forward to it.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
You. Thanks.
Okay, have a wonderful